Testing 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Hallelujah. Good afternoon, church. It's so good to be able to come back here to be able to worship with you and to share today's word. Uh, yeah, there is no coincidences in God, right? So God knows the season that we are in and what we need in every season. So I'm really very happy that we are here, that we can worship together and go into the word together. And I just want to take a moment to just thank all of the people who are involved in helping to put Sunday service together, to create this safe space for us to, and then being able to encounter the presence of God together. So, Pastor Anthony last week texted me and said that, hey, can you preach on perseverance and resilience today? Okay, so this is not like I dream up, this is my instruction from your pastor to actually talk about this. And so why do we need to talk about this? Why do we need resilience? Okay, we can go to the next slide. Why do we need resilience? I want to start by naming something that is hard to admit out loud. You know, following Jesus, loving God, loving people, doing ministry, whether you're doing in the place of this church, maybe you're serving or being one of the leaders here, or you're preaching or volunteering, or maybe you're trying to follow Jesus and love people out there in the world, trying to live faithfully. How many of you find it is a smooth journey? Nobody, right? It's not a smooth journey. And because of that, some of us carry disappointment when we pour ourselves into something and it doesn't bear fruit that we hope that will bear. Some of us carry hurt, and these wounds can be very, very deep if it comes from the people in the community that were supposed to be safe. And sometimes the wounds are so deep that we struggle to heal, to find healing on them. And then some of us, maybe you don't carry disappointments, maybe you don't carry hurt, but maybe you carry loneliness because you show up in your situation that you are being called to, whether it's in church or outside of church, week after week. You pour yourself in, you give, you serve, and then you wonder, does anybody actually see my contribution? Does anybody really care about me? Am I just a piece of machinery in this whole world, in this whole system? And some of us, come to the point of carrying despair. Despair is this sense that, you know what, I can do anything, but nothing's really going to change in the end. The same struggles are going to keep repeating, and the people that I keep investing in are going to keep walking away from my life. And it's tough. When we don't have the tools, the rhythms or relationships that help us heal and renew, something inside us happens. We start protecting ourselves, take care of ourselves, and then we shut down instead of opening ourselves up. We may show up, but our hearts get heavier and harder, and we start running on empty. Sometimes we can even become more efficient in what we are doing because, we just want to get it over and done with in the way that we help and serve. But we become less alive, less joyful in the process. And sometimes, without realizing it, we lose the reason why we do it, the reason why we serve, the reason why we love, the reason why we care about others. We lose that joy and that tenderness that drew us into ministry in the first place. And so, when we stop tending to our inner life, we end up serving out of this emptiness because we are running on empty already, instead of overflow of God's love in our lives. And that's why we need resilience. Resilience is not there to keep us in ministry, but to keep us wholeness. And the Apostle Paul knew this too. We're going to go into the second letter to the Corinthian church, which is Paul's most personal and vulnerable letter that he writes in the New Testament. In this letter, he confesses in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8, we were so utterly, unbearably crushed that we despaired of life itself. That's how he was feeling. He was so unbearably crushed that he despaired of life itself. This is coming from the Apostle Paul. This is the man who planted churches, write scripture, saying, I am done. I have come to the end of myself. But then, somehow later in this letter, in letter of 2 Corinthians, he goes from, I am crushed and despairing of life itself. He writes this defiant confession. He says, we are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. So somewhere between chapter 1 and chapter 4, something happened. Somewhere between despair and hope, Paul encountered God's grace, discovering that perseverance isn't powered by determination, but sustained by God's divine presence. So that's what we're going to talk about today, resilience. What does it mean to live and serve by the grace of God? We just sang the song. We're going to sing it again later, okay? How do we keep going without becoming hard or hollow? How do we cultivate resilience that is grounded in grace, not in effort, so that the life of Jesus is made visible regardless of the cracks that we have in our lives? Because in the end, resilience isn't about pushing through and trying to tong even more. It's about being embraced through. It's not about being strong. It's about staying soft and tender. It's not about perfection, but it's about connection. And that's what we're going to explore today. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the treasure and the clay, grace in our fragility. So in the text, core text for today, in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7, and if you have Bibles, you can go to it. Paul begins verse 7 by saying, we have this treasure in clay jars. In clay jars. Now, you know, maybe we don't know, I have an image of clay jars, but everything down at back at the time was made of clay. Okay, the closest thing that we make of clay today that's very readily available are our plant pots, right? Okay, so I went to go and get a plant pot, and this is, you know, clay, right? This is our clay, the equivalent of clay jars, right? So this is what Paul is talking about. This is what Paul says, that we have this treasure, meaning the grace of God, in clay jars like this. Not marble, not steel, not bronze, clay. And clay is very ordinary, right? It's available everywhere. It's made of mud. It's very fragile, and it's very easily cracked. So of course, outside, what happened was that it cracked outside, okay, when I was bringing it in. And that's us. Fragile bodies, fragile egos, fragile patience. That's what it looks like. This is us. Sorry, I broke your pot. And yet, inside all of this vulnerability, we carry something sacred. This is going to be the container to which God's love, God's grace, God's light is carried. But verse 7 goes on to say that we have this treasure in clay jars so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and doesn't come from us. So the point isn't to look strong. It is for us to reveal the source of strength. So grace shines around weakness, not through weakness and not through strength. The cracks aren't failures. They become the openings where light comes through. So that kind of light, you know, doesn't stay bright on its own. It needs to be tended. It needs to have space to breathe, roots to draw from, and a rhythm to keep our souls grounded when everything else feels fragile. So what do? Henry Nouwen, in the next slide, captures this beautifully. Henry Nouwen says that ministry is actually the least important thing because it is the overflow of a life of solitude and community. So what he meant is that what sustains ministry is not commitment, it's not effort. It comes from rootedness. And rootedness grows from a rhythm of solitude to community to ministry. That's why you see that circle there. So what is this rhythm about? Let's start with solitude. Solitude is where we connect with God on our own. We remember who we are, that we are beloved creation of God. We are children of God, held by grace before we do anything for God. In solitude, we learn to notice God's presence as not this God who is remote, far away, but as the one who is already here with us. As we sang earlier, God is our Emmanuel. It's where we slow down enough to see that grace has actually already been at work in our lives. All the small mercies that we may have missed in our hurry. A check-in from a friend, kindness of strangers, potential disasters that was avoided, and sometimes the parking space that miraculously appeared when we were rushing for time. Amen. And that practice of gratitude becomes the doorway to that awareness. So when you have time of solitude, it's not just sit there and If we're actually doing something in that process, we are actually practicing gratitude, which is the doorway to that awareness. When we practice gratitude, we awaken to God's grace in our lives. We begin to realize that what sustains our lives is not scarcity, but abundance. Everything that flows from the divine. It is not performance that sustains us, but God's presence in our lives. And when we practice gratitude, we can reframe our experiences, change the perspective of our experiences and what has happened to us to see how God's grace has always been with us. So instead of saying that what I've gone through is a curse, the fact that we have survived it and seen how God has taken us through it, we can be grateful to that and see God's grace at work. So that's solitude. Now after solitude and we connect with the divine, we practice gratitude, we move over into community. And this is where we practice being human together. The Bible has designed us to be in relationship with one another because it's important to learn to both give and receive grace. And learn that we cannot do and we will never design to do this life of faith on our own. And you know what, right? True community is not perfect. When you get really integrated in community, it is very, very messy. But it is also where we keep showing up for one another and we learn to practice gentleness and honesty, both in giving it and receiving it as well. So, ministry then naturally comes as an overflow of solitude and community, not as an obligation, not as a duty, but as an outpouring. Gratitude fills our well, and grace overflows into others, allows it to overflow into others. So when the well is empty, there's nothing to pour out, and we need to fill our well through solitude and community. And so, when one part of this rhythm is missing, ministry will eventually suffer. And for me personally, I've gone through so many seasons where I forget to slow down to connect with God. I'm very busy for God, but I don't slow down to connect with God. And other times, I show up for others, but what happens in my relationship with them? I keep my guard up. I mistake self-protection for strength. But this kind of effort this kind of approach runs on my effort and my logic, not on God's grace. True resilience begins when we stop trying to prove that we are strong enough, but start trusting that we are beloved enough. True resilience begins when we stop trying to prove that we are strong enough, but start trusting that we are beloved enough. Then ministry can become a flow, not a grind, not an obligation. When the treasure is grace, the jar doesn't need to be perfect. So that's number one. Grace in our fragility. Number two, afflicted but not crushed. Grace in our limits. So Paul goes on to write in verse 8, we are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. Now, this is a big change from what happened in chapter 1, but Paul's still going to go through still going through the struggle, and he doesn't try to make it seem like everything is fine. He names it. I'm afflicted, I'm perplexed, I'm persecuted, I am struck down, right? And ministry, leadership, discipleship, following Jesus, all bring moments that are going to test us in this, as it tested Paul. Next slide. So this is one thing that's where this author, Mel Robbins, offers some surprising spiritual wisdom. She's a secular author, but she wrote this book called The Let Them Theory. And I'm putting up these books in case you all want to go back and refer to them and have something good to read. But this is one of the best books, I think probably the best book I read this year. And basically, she says in her book, if people want to go, let them. If people want to misunderstand you, let them. If people want to choose differently and not choose you, let them. At first when I read this, right, I was like, wow, this sounds very detached, like some Buddhism, is it? But it's not actually about it. At its heart, it's about release, surrendering control about what we cannot control, and trust that grace is still at work when we can't see it. You know, many times I realize that I get exhausted, not because I'm loving people, but I'm trying to manage how they respond. Hello? Does that sound familiar? Why are you all looking around at other people? So Paul echoes this in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 6. He says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. Not I am responsible for the growth. God gave the growth. And so, in Mel Robbins' book, this is where the let them theory meets the let me theory. So the let me theory, so let them is surrendering control of others, right? You surrender control of trying to control others. Then let me is about reclaiming what is mine to live and embody. They can do whatever, but let me know what I can do and what I need to embody. Let me keep showing up. Let me keep maintaining my rhythms of solitude and community. Let me love with boundaries. Let me rest when I'm weary. Let me trust that God's grace is enough for what I'm called to. Let me release what isn't mine so I can be faithful to what is. Very powerful stuff. Very simple stuff, but very powerful stuff. And so together, Mel Robbins' let them and let me theories free us from this illusion that everything depends on us. It's not. Resilience isn't about holding tighter. It's about the wisdom of grace that knows its limits. So, number 2, resilience is about grace in our limits. Okay? Let's go to number 3. Always carrying death so that life may be seen. Grace in our participation. In verse 10 of 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul goes on to write, we always carry in our body the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus may be made visible. At first reading, this sounds like a very, very strange sentence. I'm carrying the death of Jesus so that life can be seen. But Paul isn't, talking about Halloween. He's not being morbid. He's describing a pattern here, the way of transformation. You see, the life of Jesus, he's saying here, doesn't avoid death. It moves through death. Resilience in the kingdom isn't about bouncing back. It is about being changed. And so there is this theologian, pastor, Dr. Barbara Brown Taylor, next slide, who puts it this way in this book that she has written. New life starts in the dark, whether it is a seed in the ground, a baby in the womb, or Jesus in the tomb. New life starts in the dark. That's the book from the book Learning to Walk in the Dark. These deaths that we carry, the losses, the disappointments, and letting go, aren't signs of God's absence. They are the soil where resurrection is going to take place. That's why we're Christians. We believe in the resurrection. We all carry little deaths. The death of certainty, of what things used to be, our ability to control a situation. But if we allow grace to hold them, they become soil for new life. And that's what resilience looks like. Not the avoidance of pain, but allowing grace to transform it. Another author, I'm pulling out all my big wigs today. Next slide. Next author I want to talk about is Brené Brown. We all love Brené Brown, right? After researching courage and shame for many years, she writes, as one of her summaries, vulnerability is not weakness. It is our greatest measure of courage. Vulnerability is what happens when we stop pretending and start showing up as who we truly are. Uncertain, imperfect, exposed, and still choose to love, still choose to try, still choose to believe. That is what courage looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to step into it with honesty and heart. And Brené Brown discovered that people who live the most wholeheartedly, the most wholly, are the ones who have befriended pain. You can't numb emotions selectively, she says. But what it means is that if you learn to say that I'm not sad, you also end up not experiencing joy in your life. You cannot choose, I'm not going to say I block sadness and not also block a possibility to have joy in the process. You see, the cracks we try to hide are the very places that grace is trying to reach. So Paul's carrying the death of Jesus isn't about glorifying suffering. It is about staying open to God's grace to work in the middle of it. It is choosing, even in death and pain, not to close one's heart. And that's why vulnerability becomes the birthplace of resilience. Because when we allow ourselves to feel the full weight of life, the loss and the love and the longing, we're staying open in the same sacred pattern that Jesus himself lived. The courage to stay open through the pain so that love can keep flowing through us. The world doesn't need perfect ministers. It just needs honest witnesses. People who can say, yes, I've been struck down, but I have also been raised up by God. And resurrection, for us, may happen in very slow motion, but resurrection is still happening if we allow God's grace into it. So, in summary, Paul began by calling us clay jars, fragile, yet filled with treasure. He named our afflictions and showed us that even in the dying places and broken places in our life, that can reveal the life of Christ. And he reminds us why it all holds together. It holds together because we have these treasure in clay jars so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and not to us. That is the power of grace. Grace is the source of the power that carries our fragile vessels, sustains us in our limits, and brings new life out of loss. And when we remember grace as the source, the cracks in the clay become channels where light ends up shining through the cracks. Not reasons to hide away and to say that, we are ashamed of it. These allow light to shine through. Our limits invite us to surrender instead of keeping striving. Our losses become the place that God allows resurrection to start. And where our vulnerability turns to courage. And all of it flows from grace. The same grace that's whispered to Paul, my grace is sufficient to you, for my power is made perfect in weakness, is whispered to us as well. So I want to invite the worship team to come back, play some soft music as we wrap up this sermon. As we close, know that in our fragility, grace embraces. In our limit, grace frees. In our losses, grace transforms. This is the extraordinary power that keeps us from not giving up. Not the strength to control, but the faith to trust. You see, grace is the pulse beneath resilience. Resilience only works when there's grace beneath it. Grace is the quiet miracle that says, you don't need to be enough, you just need to be open. So maybe the call today to you is not to try harder, is not to resist longer, but maybe it is to just trust deeper, to rest in the rhythm of solitude and community, and to let grace do what only grace can do, which is to hold you, to heal you, and to renew you to new life. So I want you to take this moment to close your eyes. Let's take a deep breath. Let's become aware of the things that we have buried. The pain, the pressures, the burdens, and also maybe the fatigue, the disappointments, the hurts, maybe the worries, the exhaustion. Take a deep breath and be aware of that you're carrying. And I want you to hear God speak into those situations that you're carrying. The same words that is spoken over to Paul. My grace is sufficient for you. My grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in your weakness. So as we sing and respond by singing together by the grace of God, let this be more than just a song that we are singing. Let this be our confession of faith. Let God embrace you in this moment, because resilience is not about being unbreakable. It is about being embraced. Amen.